Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Railroad Photography of Donald W. Furler. I'm the author and your host tonight, Scott Lothes, and I'm really excited to share this book and this photography with you. I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. You have a few different viewing options through the WebEx platform, and you can cycle through them by clicking on the round buttons in the upper right-hand corner of your main window. If you have questions or comments, you can send them with either the chat or the Q&A features. To open either of those, click on the buttons at the bottom right of your screen, and then look in the white column on the right side of your screen for the chat and the Q&A sections. I'm going to run straight through my talk tonight. I've got a lot to say in the next hour, and I don't always see messages when they come in. But Haley Page is here tonight for assistance, and she'll be happy to help. I'll be happy to stick around to take any questions at the end. I want to thank one of our board members, Michael Schmidt, as well as the Tommy Daly Foundation, who both made generous gifts to cover the first year of our WebEx subscription package. Thanks to their generosity, we've been offering free presentations every month, and you can view them on our YouTube channel, which you can find right here at youtube.com/railphotoart. We'll also post this one later in the week, and you should mark your calendars for our second virtual conference of the year on Saturday, September 19th, when we plan to take you on a journey through railroad photography and art around the world. We're charging a modest registration fee to help cover the cost of that one, and you can find details and sign up on our website at railphoto-art.org. Tonight, though, we're heading to the northeastern United States of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Compared to some of the other photographers in our archive at the Center for Railroad Photography and Art, Donald W. Furler may not have quite as much name recognition in our community, but that's certainly not due to the quality of his work. As I've gotten to know this collection over the past few years, I've learned far more than I had space to share in the book, and far more than I have time to share with you tonight. What I thought we'd do this evening is start by looking briefly at the book and the photographer. And then I want to take you behind the scenes into his working methods, as well as my thought process as photo editor, and then move into the overall significance of this photography collection and what it's come to mean to me. While I'm going to show you some photographs from the book, I'm going to share quite a few more that didn't quite make the final cut, but that I still really like. So here's the book, just off the press. This is one of the first 6 copies that we have in the office. It's hardcover, 10 by 11 inches, and 216 pages with black and white duotone printing. If you have our previous book about J. Parker Lamb's photography, you'll find this one to be pretty similar in terms of format and design. Now, I've got to restart my screen share here. Bear with me just one moment. So what I thought we'd do this evening is start by looking briefly at the book and the photographer. Oh, I already said that. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Okay, so this is the table of contents page, and you'll see we employed a similar organizational scheme to this book. It begins with my introductory essay, which spans 26 pages. Then we have a 172-page gallery of photographs, and finally an 8-page afterword by Alan G. Furler, Don's son. Within the gallery, as in the Lamb book, we include several sidebars that offer further insight into Don's photographic style. There's an index in the back that lists all of the railroads depicted in the photographs, and there's quite a bit of variety, 28 different lines. I also decided to include maps in the end papers, and David Steife did an absolutely dynamite job on them. The front end paper shows 2 regional maps of the Northeast, comparing its railroads today to how they appeared in 1946 at the zenith of Don's photography. Red dots mark locations of photos that appear in the book. The back is a 2-page detail view. What's inside that gray box on the right side there? Focused on Don's home turf of northern New Jersey, southeastern New York, and eastern Pennsylvania. Inside the book, My introductory essay tells the story of Don's life as a railroad photographer, set against the backdrop of the fast-changing railroad landscape of the Northeast. I give an overview of those changes, but mostly I describe Don's life and his photography. For that, I am deeply indebted to his son, Alan, who provided me with scans of dozens of his father's letters. He likes to imagine his dad writing these late at night at the dining room table, pounding them out hunt and peck on his old manual typewriter. Through reading those letters and listening to Alan's stories, I really feel like I've gotten to know Don, and I've tried to share some of his personality in my essay. I'll try to share a bit more tonight. I include some lengthy quotes from a few of his letters, and especially the ones to and from the first editors of Trains magazine. Trains published its first issue in November of 1940, when Don was 23 years old. He was delighted by this new development in railroad publishing, and in January 1941, he sent an introductory letter to editors Al Kalmbach and Lynn Westcott, along with a set of prints for their consideration in the magazine. Kalmbach and Westcott were equally delighted with Don's photography. Kalmbach wrote back saying he was just what the doctor ordered, and used dozens of Furler photographs over the next several years of the magazine, including at least one on the cover of the February 1943 issue shown here. For the next several years, those prints and letters passed frequently between Don's home in New Jersey and the Kalmbach offices in Milwaukee. Those letters offer some great insight into the first years of Trains magazine, long before the era of David P. Morgan. Now, if you want to skip ahead and just go ahead and buy the book, you can certainly do that. But we're taking pre-orders now on our website via PayPal, and we'll begin shipping these just as soon as our stock arrives from our printer, which should be later this week. The price is $60 plus $5 for shipping, but if you place your order tonight, we'll offer free shipping. Just go to railphoto-art.org/books. If you'd prefer not to use PayPal, you can also send a check by mail to our office. Just mention that you saw tonight's program, and we'll still give you free shipping. I'll share all of this information again at the end, but right now, I really want to tell you a little bit more about Don Furler and his photography. Don was born in 1917 in Hawthorne, New Jersey, just a couple miles from Glen Rock, which became his home in adulthood. This area is all part of the suburbs surrounding Newark and New York City. Don's boyhood home was next to the New York, Susquehanna, and Western tracks, and as a toddler, he would pull himself up to the window of his playroom to watch the Susquehanna locomotives steaming by. The bug definitely bit him early. A tinplate toy train layout soon followed in the basement, as did many trips by train, since his family didn't own a car when Don was young. Photography came along pretty early too, and I describe this at some length in the book. Suffice it to say that Don had a penchant for detail and clarity that led him on a quest for ever larger cameras, including an enormous 8x10 city view camera when he was still a teenager. The view camera was great for making engine portraits, which were very much the rage among railroad enthusiasts of the 1930s. And while Don enjoyed them, he also longed for something more. In one of his early letters to the editors of Trains magazine, Don described steam locomotives at rest as quiet monsters, and how he had wanted action shots that showed those quiet monsters coming to life. This desire positioned Don on the leading edge of amateur railroad photographers, and through his influence at Trains magazine, and among his many friends at local railroad clubs and organizations, he helped establish a new photographic aesthetic of the action shot. His first camera capable of sharp action shots was a postcard format Graflex he purchased in the late 1930s. This was a folding camera that he could slip into a coat pocket, and he used it to capture some truly remarkable views. Excuse me. While he was commuting on the Erie to attend college at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, where he received a degree in mechanical engineering in 1938. These are all views around Communipol Terminal in Jersey City. There's a few of these in the book. In 1939, Don upgraded to a 4x5 speed graphic, considered by most to be the ultimate camera for action photography of the era. The 4x5 negative is nearly twice as large as the postcard format, But it still wasn't big enough for Don Furler. So in March of 1941, he upgraded again, this time to a 5x7 speed graphic that became his signature camera. The 5x7 negative is nearly twice the size of a 4x5, giving Don the tremendous clarity of detail he so strongly desired for his photographs. And just in case you're wondering, here's how a little 35mm negative compares. By this time, Don had also met his bride, Marie Ellen Wida, of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Don's grandparents lived in Allentown, and Marie was the best friend of one of Don's cousins. Alan tells me that their early dates usually consisted of going for walks along the railroad tracks. The speed graphic often served as chaperone. I think it's fair to say that Marie knew what she was getting herself into when she and Don were married in 1942. They soon bought a home in Glen Rock, and I don't think you'll be surprised when I tell you that the main line of the Erie Railroad ran just across the street. That's a David Maney photograph at upper left from 1953, and you can see the Furler's house on the far left. Below, I've included a recent satellite image from Google. You can still ride through here on NJ Transit commuter trains, which stop at a station just a quarter-mile away. This is one of Don's photographs of Marie waving from their front yard to an Erie passenger train, the eastbound Mountain Express. Incidentally, the engineer of this train was a man named Bill Smith, and Bill and his wife became good friends with Don and Marie, with the older Smiths taking the newlywed Furlers under their wings. There's a great story about how they met, but you'll either have to buy the book or ask Alan to tell you sometime. Don's early photography subjects were his hometown railroads, but in 1939 he got his first car, a 1937 Ford that he affectionately named Lizzie, and that greatly expanded his territory. In a time before interstate highways, Don put 34,000 miles on Lizzie in the first year alone. Somehow, Lizzie was still going strong 10 years later in 1949, as this photo from Alan attests. That's him peering out from behind the rear window, with his sister Nancy posing in the driver's seat. Don loved mountain railroading. With his new mobility, he made several trips to the Appalachians of western Pennsylvania, Maryland, and West Virginia, where he covered the Pennsy, the Baltimore and Ohio, and especially the western Maryland. These trips became more frequent in the 1950s as steam waned on his hometown roads in the Northeast. Closer to home, around 1950, he shifted most of his focus to the Delaware and Hudson, where big steam continued running until 1953. And then he went north, making several trips to Canada, where steam lasted into 1960. He also enjoyed writing and photographing steam fan trips, but his photography declined sharply with the end of regular steam service. Alan joined his dad on many of these later trips, as well as for many railfan social gatherings, and he writes about some of these in his afterword. Don started shooting color slides in the mid-1950s with a Leica 35mm camera. That actually puzzles both Alan and me. As good as the Leica was, the slides lacked the detail and clarity of Don's big black and white negatives that had been his hallmark for so many years. For the book, it was an easy decision for me to focus exclusively on the black and white photographs. It's simpler from a production standpoint and more cohesive from a design standpoint. Ultimately, these are two different bodies of work. The color slides depict steam in its final days of regular service, and then the fan trips that followed with preserved locomotives. There are some excellent shots, and Alan is working on an article about them for the next issue of Classic Trains magazine. But the black and white negatives present steam when it was still in its glory, and that's what I wanted to showcase in the book. Don took his photography seriously. He often wore a coat and tie when he went into railroad yards to photograph steam locomotives, and that inspired me to dress up a little tonight as well. But he tried not to take these pursuits too seriously. This is another David Maney photograph, this one showing a railfan fiasco on the Delaware and Hudson, where the chase vehicle got stuck in the mud. Don's best friend, Bob Collins, gestures in frustration as the train passes, probably utters a few choice words. George Crumb and Dick Horstman look on in disbelief. Don, at far left, leans on the shovel and appears to be laughing. He could still find humor in their predicament. As we get more into Don's photography and look at just how much time he devoted to it, you may start to think of Marie as something of a railroad photography widow, and for a time that might even have been true. But what I also know from talking to Alan is that his dad was a loving and devoted husband, father, and grandfather. Don and Marie raised 4 children, doted on their grandchildren, and celebrated their golden wedding anniversary in 1992, shown here, 2 years before Don died at the age of 77. 10 years later, for the Center's second annual conference in 2004, our founder, John Gruber, was working on a presentation with David Plowden about railroad photographers who were creative but almost forgotten. They included Don Furler, and as part of their research, John tracked down Alan and got in touch with him. Alan began attending our conferences, and through that, decided to donate his father's photography to us in 2017. In one of our early conversations, Alan asked me directly whether I thought his photography, with its more classical style, would be a good fit at the center, given our frequent emphasis on creativity as well as the human side of railroading. I assured Alan that I considered his father's work to be one of the cornerstones of railroad photography that all of us who came later have built upon. I meant those words when I said them, and I have since come to understand the foundational nature of Don Furler's photography on an even deeper level. I need to give you some background here, and to do that, I'm going to share a couple of the quotes from Don's letters. Don was a man who knew what he liked, as well as what he didn't like, and he was not shy when it came to sharing his photographic preferences. When he was shopping for his 5x7 camera, he wrote directly to the Fulmer Graphics Corporation, explaining that the camera which I intend to purchase is to be used for one purpose only, that of photographing railroad trains in action. And when it came to photographing railroad trains in action, Don had very specific tastes. In a letter to Lynn Westcott at Trains magazine, Don wrote, "A good action shot can show sufficient mechanical detail of the engine to be interesting from that standpoint, and yet be dramatic enough to be effective." These are the kinds of pictures Don took almost exclusively, and the kinds he wished to see published in his favorite magazine. "My severest criticism," he once wrote to Al Kalmbach, "would be the high proportion of unusual views." As I read more of Don's letters and came to understand what he meant by unusual views, I realized they are often exactly the sorts of shots that I have prioritized in my own photography over much of the past 2 decades. So why on earth did I write a book about Donald W. Furler's photography? I'm going to shift gears now to talk more about Don's methodology, as well as my own thought process for selecting photographs for the book. Along the way, I hope to show you why Don's photography has come to mean so much to me. For one thing, tastes change. Don's did, thanks in part to his dialogue with Kalmbach and Westcott, and thanks as well to his many friendships with other photographers, including the great Jim Shaughnessy, who took no shortage of unusual views himself, and which Don came to appreciate and even admire. My own taste evolved over the course of this project too, and seeing Don's work helped remind me of some of my earliest railroad interests. Long before I was a photographer with a camera seeking unusual views of the diesel railroad, I was a kid with a pencil, trying to draw steam locomotives. And there's at least one part of Don's photographic philosophy where I stand in complete agreement: to take but few pictures if necessary, and take them well. To see how this philosophy played out, let's head 60 miles northwest of Glen Rock to Mill Rift, Pennsylvania. Now, of course, the interstates didn't exist when Don was photographing steam locomotives, so he would have traveled on State Route 23. Shorter, but it takes more time with all those little towns along the way, close to 2 hours from Glen Rock. Erie fans will know that Mill Rift is the place where the railroad crosses the Delaware River on this 4-span, pin-connected truss bridge built in 1895. It's still in service today, 125 years old, and still carrying trains on its one remaining track, the New York, Susquehanna, and Western. To the best of my knowledge, this is Don's first photograph at Mill Rift, which he took on August 27, 1939. He would probably want me to tell you that that's one of the Erie's big R2 class 210-2s leading this freight train west. He definitely would not have been satisfied with that thin, faint line of exhaust. Don loved big plumes of smoke and steam, and this would have been a disappointment. And nor was he entirely satisfied with the size of the postcard format negative from his folding Graflex camera. Once he upgraded to his 4x5 speed graphic later that year, he returned to Mill Rift on December 1st. This is train number 1, the Erie Limited, whose K5A Pacific locomotive was making plenty of exhaust on this snow-dusted day, but a strong wind down the river was blowing the steam back over the train. Don wanted lots of exhaust, but he was very particular about where. Steam obscuring the train was not good. He would have had some choice words for this fiasco. Luckily for Don, and for us, the Erie was a busy railroad in 1939, and we know that freight follows passenger. Not long after the Limited passed, along came S1 Berkshire number 3304 leading a time freight west, and the wind had died down enough to let the steam partially lift above the train. This still wouldn't have been perfect for Don, but he would have liked this a lot better than what he got with the passenger train. With Europe already at war in December of 1939, business was picking up on American railroads, and this turned out to be a case of freight follows passenger. Another S1, the 3320, soon crossed the Delaware. Judging from the enormous salt and pepper exhaust plume, the 3320 was working a lot harder than the 3304 on the previous train. The early afternoon had swung around just enough to start lighting up the stone faces of the bridge piers. The exhaust isn't completely clear of the train, but you can see a lot of it, and I'd like to think Don would have been happy with this. I certainly am. But he kept trying. He next returned about 5 months later, on May 12, 1940, when he recorded Train 27, the Mountain Express, bound for Hornell, New York, behind K4B Pacific 2745. This train would have left Port Jervis, 4 miles from here, just a little before 7 p.m. You can see that the shadows are getting long and the sun is almost straight down the tracks. Plus, there's not much smoke. So it should come as little surprise that Don came back. This is November 21st of 1940, when the colder weather led to better exhaust, this time without any pesky wind blowing down the river. The days were too short to see Train 27, but Train 9, the local from Jersey City to Elmira, was due through a little after 4 p.m. And boy, was this ever a milk run. There are 7 cars before you get to the baggage car, and then there's just that single coach rattling around back there on the end. Once again, freight follows passenger. This is another Berkshire, S3 Class 3353, with what I have to imagine is just about Don Furler's ideal exhaust plume, a mix of black smoke and white steam erupting vertically out of the stack and trailing back well above the train, which is completely visible here. But of course, there was no sun on this cloudy November day. So Don came back, but not for almost 7 years. And when he did, on September 4th, 1947, it was cloudy again. So he moved further around the curve and tried something different with this vertical shot. The exhaust from this 284 was just about perfect for this particular view. Don also had a bigger camera this time, his 5x7 speed graphic. As far as I can tell, this is the only time he took this particular view at Mill Rift, and I like it for the variety. But we know this is the view Don was still trying to perfect. This is local train number 9 again, on September 7th, 1947, just 3 days after the previous shot. Look at how much the vegetation has grown up in the foreground since 1940. The train is bigger too, with 9 cars ahead of the baggage car and 2 coaches behind it. A total of 12 cars, enough for a K5 Pacific. But of course, it's not making much smoke, so by now you should know, Don will be back. And this was the day, nearly a year later, August 15th, 1948, with not a cloud in the sky. An S3 class Berkshire is making plenty of smoke with a time freight in the late afternoon. The sun is shining straight over Don's shoulders and the exhaust is high up in the sky where he would have wanted it, allowing a clear view of the train and the background. Perfection at last. It only took 6 visits and 10 trains over a span of 9 years. And just for good measure, Don got a second westbound here on this perfect August afternoon, with a 210-2 leading a long train of empty hoppers from a slightly lower position on the hillside. That makes a total of 11 shots from this location. As far as I can tell, Don didn't return again. and steam only lasted for a few more years on the Erie. I've shown you all these views from Mill Rift because they say a lot about the kind of photographer Don Furler was. He had good taste. He liked spots where the locomotives would be working hard for a lot of drama, but that were also open enough to provide some context and interesting enough to say something about the railroad and the landscape through which it passed. He knew exactly what he wanted in terms of lighting, wind, and smoke. When he found a spot he liked, he kept going back until he got the shot just the way he wanted it. It didn't matter to him if that spot was just down the road from his house or a 2-hour drive away, and sometimes much further than that. Mill Rift was certainly not the only place where Don returned again and again. He had dozens of favorite spots where he kept trying to perfect his photographs. My dilemma as photo editor was which of these 11 shots to include in the book. They're all good, but Don has many hundreds of good shots in his collection from many different places, and so I couldn't justify more than one of these views from Mill Rift. I have a feeling that Don's favorite was probably one of the last two, the pair from August 15th, 1948. The conditions were just about perfect for him, and he was there with his best camera, his 5x7 speed graphic. This is undeniably a fine photograph, and probably the one that's most representative of Don's photographic vision. I would have been proud to publish this one, or the other view from the same day, but Don's collection gave me other options. I chose this one, showing the last train from his second visit, back on December 1st, 1939. If I could have only one photograph to say everything I want to say about Don Furler and his photography at Mill Rift, Pennsylvania, this is it. Even though the exhaust obscures part of the train, it's so dramatic and with so much texture. The low winter sun rakes across the scene from right to left, creating high contrast and those lovely highlights in the bridge stonework. And I love how the snow on the ground helps bring out the landscape beneath those leafless trees. This, to me, is an incredible photograph, one that speaks not only to the drama of steam railroading, but also to the beauty of these river valleys of the Northeast, the indelible mark of railway engineering, and the power of black and white photography to preserve it all in a way that we can still enjoy it 8 decades later. There's something else, too. I have no way of knowing, for certain, which photograph Don ultimately favored. I can't ask him. He died 26 years ago. I have talked at length with his son, Alan, who continues to generously and enthusiastically support our work at the center and share his great knowledge of his father's photography. And thanks to Alan, I have a pretty good idea of which shot Don would have favored from Mill Rift, but I can't be sure. And as I said earlier, I know that tastes change. Mine have, and I know Don's did too. So I chose not to compensate for my own tastes as I made my selections for this book. In fact, I'd say I embraced my own tastes as I chose which photographs to include, like this pastoral scene on the Lehigh and Hudson River that I just adore, and that I boldly splashed a full bleed across 2 pages in the book. The mission of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. In our archival work, we preserve, and we try to preserve artistic intent alongside the photographs themselves. In our publications, we present, and when I'm in the role of editor, I see it as my job, as my duty, to give the work the best presentation I can provide. Don Furler was an exacting photographer who had a clear vision for what made the best railroad photographs, and I looked for images that I believe met his highest standards. He was also a daring photographer, one who was not afraid to take chances by shooting on the dark side, on cloudy days, far away from the tracks, and even from unusual perspectives. And he took these chances in an era when film was a limited, expensive, and time-consuming resource. Every shot was the result of careful planning, strategic resource allocation, and skillful execution. Every photograph in this book is one that Don thought enough of to take in the first place, and then to carefully preserve. From that perspective, you might say that literally any combination of photographs I could have picked would have been true to Don's original vision. And so I looked first for those images that struck the deepest resonance with me, because I knew they would be the ones that I would be the most excited to share with you. So let's look at some more of them. Returning to the subject of Erie Railroad bridges, let's talk briefly about their most famous, Starrucka Viaduct in Lanesboro, Pennsylvania. Now this, of course, is a Delaware and Hudson train going under Starrucka, and this photograph is in the book. As far as I can tell, it's one of only 2 Furler photographs that shows Starrucka Viaduct. This is the other one, and if I hadn't told you it shows the viaduct, would you have even known it's there? You can just barely see the stonework down there at lower right. This is a nice enough view of an Erie 284, but since this is a westbound train drifting downgrade, there's not much smoke. And let me assure you that we have an abundance of nice views of Erie 284s in this collection. Now, on the far right edge of the frame, there appears to be a clearing on the hillside that would have allowed a photographer to step away from the tracks and take in more of the scene with an eastbound train charging upgrade. But I don't think Don ever did that. Had I found such a shot in his collection, you'd better believe I would have splashed it across 2 pages. It's worth noting that Lanesboro is 150 miles northwest of Furler's home, 2.5 times farther than Mill Rift, and probably close to a 4-hour drive on the roads of the 1940s. Yet Don's records clearly show that he made that drive several times, and just not for the purpose of photographing trains on Starrucka Viaduct. His priority at Lanesboro was this spot, 3/4 of a mile north of the viaduct, a sweeping curve on a fill offering a clear view of eastbound trains climbing the grade. This is train number 2, the Erie Limited, on the same day as the previous shot, April 20th, 1941. Don liked the spot well enough to return at least twice more. The shot I just showed you is at upper left, and next to it, at upper middle, is a double-headed freight train on the same day. The lower row shows 3 views from a summer day in 1943. At left is the Erie Limited again, running up track 1 while overtaking a slower freight on track 2. Don also shot that freight, plus another one, seen on the bottom row at middle and right. Both were double-headed and also had a pusher locomotive. And the view at upper right shows a cherry train on August of 1949 from a slightly higher perspective. Of these 6 views, I decided to use the one lower right in the book. The light's just great, and I love that U-shaped plume of smoke from the lead engine. That's 210-2, 4115, a 284, and Don noted that the pusher was another 210-2, the 4126. Between them were 100 cars. This is, without a doubt, a great shot of 1940s railroading in the mountains of northeastern Pennsylvania. I just wish we also had a better view of a train crossing Starrucka Viaduct. Don had his priorities. And while he worked hard to include scenery and infrastructure, the train, and especially the locomotive, came first. Let's take a deep dive into one more photograph, the cover shot. This is Tuxedo, New York, where we find another Erie 210-2 storming west with a long train of empty hopper cars on October 22nd, 1944. I have to admit, I was pretty excited when I first discovered this shot in Don's collection. While he didn't avoid shooting from the dark side, it wasn't something he did very often, and it was especially rare for him in a scenic location like this one. But I love the backlighting here, for the drama it creates, with contrast that spans the full range from white to black. And for something Don didn't do very often, he certainly did it well. The exposure is just perfect. So is the composition. I love how he got right up close to those rocks in the foreground at lower right. I sent a scan of this shot to Alan right away, and that led to some playful back and forth between us, with Alan initially downplaying this shot, even as I continued to build it up. I had no idea at the time that I would use it on the cover of our book, but I did know it was special, and I think Don knew that too. If this had been a throwaway shot for him, he certainly wouldn't have taken it more than once. But he tried it 3 times. This is the Erie Limited on the same day, probably running just ahead of the freight train. This is a fine photograph in its own right, and the lower exhaust plume makes it easier to crop this to our widescreen format for our high-definition monitors. But I ultimately favor the shot with the freight train, where the higher exhaust plume allows a clear view of the hopper cars and the river disappearing into the background. I guess Don's tastes are rubbing off on me. He came back to this spot in May of '45, when the sunlight had swung around enough to illuminate the side of the train facing Don. But there wasn't much exhaust on this warm spring day, and the drama he had found in October is missing here. He didn't try this shot again. And I'd like to think that's because he knew he had already done the best he possibly could here. When the time came to choose the cover for the book, I didn't even consider this photograph at first. I knew it was something of an outlier, and so when Jeff Browse was ready to design the cover, I sent in several other views that I thought were more representative of Don's style. Jeff made PDFs of each version and sent them to Kevin Keefe and me for our consideration. The three of us couldn't agree on any of them. Each one presented a particular locomotive on a particular railroad. We needed a shot that could speak for all steam locomotives in the Northeast. On a whim, I sent this photograph to Jeff. As soon as he sent back the PDF, all three of us knew we'd found our cover. With these three in-depth examples from Mill Rift, Lanesboro, and Tuxedo, I've tried to give you some insight into Don's photographic methodology, as well as my thought process in choosing images for the book. I'm going to pull back now and talk more about Don's collection and its significance. And to do that, I'm going to focus on a single year. One thing I noticed as I worked my way through Don's collection was how many of my favorite photographs came from just one year, 1946. So when we finished processing his black and white negatives, I pulled all of their metadata into a single Excel spreadsheet and I sorted it by date. We have 6,128 black and white negatives spanning 1931 to 1962. 800 of them come from 1946. That's 13% of the total, and nearly twice as many as he took in his next best year. Let's consider for a moment what a year 1946 must have been for Don Furler. He turned 29 on August 10th, and he had started his family just a few years earlier in their house next to the Erie in Glen Rock. The war was over. No more gas rationing, no more travel restrictions, far fewer security concerns about trackside photography. The post-war economy was booming, and railroads across the country were humming with both freight and passenger traffic. Steam locomotives still handled the vast majority of this business, and each day hundreds of them went storming out across the dense network of railroads surrounding Don Furler's home. There were signs that this was about to change. The New York, Susquehanna, and Western had replaced the last of its steam with diesel during the previous year, making it one of the first railroads in the nation to do so. Diesels were beginning to show up on other roads too. Cars and buses had already cut into the rail passenger business before the war, and this trend was poised to continue. Much harder to foresee, I think, was the sweeping deindustrialization that would soon fall on the Northeast, and the profound impact that would have on its railroads. But even without any hints of that, for someone who loved to photograph steam locomotives, 1946 dawned with enough harbingers of change to create a sense of urgency. This moment would pass. Catch it now, or watch it slip through your fingers. I think Don Furler must have been aware of this. In 1946, he unleashed 4 years of pent-up photographic desire, born out of wartime restrictions and the long work hours the war effort had demanded of him at his job testing aircraft engines. Here's a calendar for 1946. And here it is with each day circled when Don Furler made at least one railroad photograph. I won't make you count. There are 114 circles. They include 34 Saturdays and 42 Sundays. For the year, only 4 weekends passed without Don making any railroad photographs. Now, it certainly helped that all he had to do was step outside his home to shoot the Erie, and most of his weekday photography happened during the long days of summer when he could catch a few trains after work. But on most of the weekends, he traveled widely throughout the region. What this calendar means to me is that Don Furler recognized that his moment had come, and he went out and seized it. I find that beautiful. This life is ultimately a tragedy for all of us. None of us are getting out of here alive, and we're destined to lose everything and everyone we love. The best we can hope for is to make ours a beautiful tragedy, one where we can savor the best of what we love. That's something I see in Don Furler's 1946. The steam railroading in the Northeast would never again be as good as it was in 1946. If you waited just a few more years and only went out to see the last runs of steam before the diesels fully took over, you'd already missed the best part. Don was there for the best of the best. His first trackside outing in 1946 came on Saturday, January 5th, He started right in Glen Rock, where he caught Erie 2748 steaming east with train 30. From there, he headed 40 miles north to Hamptonburg, where he found one of the Lehigh and Hudson Rivers 482s leading a freight train west through the snow-dusted fields. Don and Marie had family in Allentown, and he was there for the first weekend of February, which Don naturally used to go to good photographic advantage on the Reading, the Lehigh Valley, and the central of New Jersey. His efforts included this shot of the Lehigh Valley's westbound Black Diamond behind a pair of 462s near Trichlers, Pennsylvania. He positioned himself on the inside of this curve in a cleared field to capture both engines and 14 cars in this panoramic view. I was on the lookout for panoramic shots as I chose photos for the book. Don's big negatives have so much detail and clarity that I wanted to print them as big as I could. The 216-page book is made up of 18 12-page signatures, which means we essentially have 18 center spreads in the book, one for each signature. That's 18 opportunities to print a single photograph across 2 pages on a contiguous sheet of paper. I felt it was my duty to make the most of those 18 opportunities. This shot was a contender, but ultimately I chose a different panorama from this weekend. This view, showing the entirety of a double-headed 60-car Jersey Central coal train steaming west along the Lehigh River at Perryville, Pennsylvania, on February 2nd, 1946. I love the dramatic backlighting of the low winter sun, the partially iced-over river, and the details visible on the leafless hillside. You can see U.S. Highway 309 climbing above the train in the distance, and the lead locomotive is stepping onto a small bridge over the mouth of Pohopoco Creek, where it flows into the Lehigh River. Even more than the previous shot, I feel this view captures both the drama of steam railroading and the beauty of the land. And the photograph divides perfectly down the middle for the gutter in the book's binding. There we go. Let's continue through 1946. March was a banner month. It had 5 weekends, and Don photographed trains on 9 out of those 10 days. He hit 6 different railroads, including the New York, Ontario, and Western, on March 23rd. This is their train number 1 at Firthcliffe, New York, where it was due at 9:50 a.m. on its morning run out of Weehawken. Most railroads assign the numbers 1 and 2 to some of their most important passenger trains. This particular number 1 consisted of just 3 cars, and that doesn't bode well for the O&W's passenger business. But here comes the moneymaker right behind it. Train number 9, a milk run that didn't carry passengers and that didn't appear in the public timetable. Don turned his camera for a vertical shot to emphasize that big exhaust plume. Let's zoom in for a closer look at the train. I count at least 12 cars behind the 482, a much bigger locomotive than the 10-wheeler on train number 1. And then there's that gorgeous depot back there, a 2-story wooden affair with a witch's hat tower. It burned to the ground in 1963, a victim of arson. I suspect Don chose this spot far back from the station because he expected a bigger exhaust plume here as the engine accelerated. I haven't found any photographs in his collection that show a closer view of the station. That's happened to me a lot. And some detail at the edge of a Furler photograph catches my eye and leaves me wanting more, especially in the wake of all the railroad infrastructure we've lost in the past 75 years. I don't mean that as a criticism of Don. He knew what he wanted out of his photographs, and he made no excuses. As I have come to understand both him and his photography, I have come to credit his singularity of purpose for much of his success. That was an important realization for me as I worked on selecting photographs for the book, and it's one I wanted to share with you tonight. Neither of these last 2 photographs are in the book, but I did include 8 views of the New York, Ontario, and Western. But Furler's real star for the month of March was the Lehigh in New England, a 200-mile system that ran from Campbell Hall, New York, across northern New Jersey, and into the anthracite fields of eastern Pennsylvania. Don visited this railroad 3 times in March of 1946, and he made some incredible views. This one shows a doubleheader at Summit, Pennsylvania, and the crew has just finished assembling their 47-car train after doubling the hill up the 2.7% grade from Bath. This is another one of those views that works well as a panorama, but I have to be honest and tell you this shot wasn't even in the running for inclusion in the book. While I like the tonality of the sky, the right side just isn't all that interesting, leaving this view feeling a little bit unbalanced to me. Don has literally dozens of better shots of the Lehigh in New England. I included 11 of them in the book. He was nearly as busy in April, when he photographed trains on 7 days. 1946 was the centennial of the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and K6 Pacific 2092 is carrying a special placard to mark the occasion as it rolls through Trichlers, Pennsylvania with train number 9, Black Diamond, on April 20th. By May, the days were long enough that Don could photograph trains on weekday evenings after work. This is Erie Train 28, the Mountain Express from Hornell, New York, on the final lap of its run into Jersey City, where it was due at 6:55 p.m. Don's friend Bill Smith is waving from the cab. The date, May 23rd, is noteworthy. It was the day of the beginning of a national railroad strike, part of a series of nationwide strikes that had started in late 1945 as organized labor protested falling wages after the end of World War II. Don noted that because of the strike's beginning, the train had been switched at Ridgewood Junction to get the milk cars onto the rear so it would minimize later switching down the road. In a speech before Congress on May 25th, President Harry Truman threatened to take over control of the railroads with the U.S. Army and to draft all of the striking workers into military service. The railroad unions agreed to settle the strike before Truman's speech had ended. Furler was right back to photographing trains on May 25th, catching Erie number 27, the westbound Mountain Express, steaming through Glen Rock. If 1946 was the high-water mark of Don's photography, then that summer was the peak of the peak. He photographed trains on 15 days in June, 18 days in July, and 16 days in August. For action shots, few days could compare to Sunday, June 23rd. This was nearly the longest day of the year, not a cloud in the sky, and Don made great use of all that sunlight. He started early, with this view of Erie 3375 leading a freight train west at Central Valley, New York. The tracks angle almost due north here, so we know it's just about 8 a.m. from how the shadows fall across the front of the locomotive. Don caught 2 more freights on the Erie main line this morning. At Arden, New York, there's another 284, the 3322, leading time freight number 74 with 114 cars. And then at Campbell Hall, he found yet another Erie Berkshire, the 3381, leading train XC91 West with 80 cars. Several railroads converge in this area, making it one of Don's favorite haunts. He soon found Lehigh, New England 280 number 307, leading a mixed freight train west, which he called at Orange Farm, New York. He then found 2 trains west on the Lehigh and Hudson River Railway. Here's one of them, the 282 number 81, passing a semaphore signal near Maybrook, New York. And then one of the railroad's biggest locomotives, 482 number 12, has another westbound splitting the semaphores at Burnside. From there, Don headed about 20 miles east to the Hudson Valley, probably crossing by ferry at Newburgh, since the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge was still 17 years in the future. This was the 3rd consecutive Sunday afternoon he had spent on the New York Central Main Line, so he knew exactly where to go and when. He arrived at Breakneck Ridge in time to catch Train 41, the Knickerbocker, heading west on the 4-track main line behind a pair of E-unit diesel locomotives. 41 was due out of Harmon, 21 miles away, at 3:32 p.m., so the time here must be a few minutes before 4 p.m. He then moved slightly upriver and climbed a signal bridge to catch 484 Niagara locomotive 6001, leading another passenger train west. He didn't record its number, but I suspect this is train 65, the advanced Commodore Vanderbilt, which left Harmon at 4:01 and would have passed here just before 4:30. A pedestrian overpass at Breakneck Bridge Station in the background provided his next vantage point. Shown here, where he caught another Niagara, the 6024, marching downriver with an eastbound passenger train. You can see the signal bridge in the distance that he climbed for the previous shot. From there, he hustled into Cold Spring, 3 miles downriver, where the 4-track main line crosses a causeway separating Foundry Cove on the left from the Hudson River on the right. This is Train 67, the Commodore Vanderbilt, with Niagara 6010 doing the honors, nicely framed by the cantilevered signal bridge. Train 67 departed from Grand Central Terminal 30 minutes behind Train 65, which we saw 2 shots earlier. Don then climbed that signal bridge for the next 3 westbounds. This is a Hudson locomotive, number 5435, with what Don called a local train. From the June 1946 timetable, I suspect this is Train 367 for Utica. It made limited stops as far as Albany, which would explain why it's running on the inside express track rather than on the outside local track. 367 followed Train 67 by 4 minutes, so the timing jives with Don's positioning here. 11 minutes later would have been Train 15, the Ohio State Limited, with Niagara 6007 storming up the Hudson. This was one of 14 different trains that New York Central ran from New York to Chicago every day in 1946. Note the group of young women at right walking along the tracks by the river. Don was not the only person trespassing with impunity on the railroad this Sunday afternoon. It was a different world back then. 10 minutes behind that train was 6012 with train number 1, the all-coach pacemaker, 6021. So which of these 3 exceptional photographs should I use in the book? The one of the Hudson? One of the 2 Niagaras? It's actually a trick question. The answer turned out to be D, none of the above, but only because Don gave me an even better option. We'll see that in just a moment. But first, he took a short walk down the tracks to the other side of Constitution Island, where he caught Hudson 5217 rolling west with train 23 from Poughkeepsie. And then he returned to his perch on the signal bridge. For a moment of pure serendipity, his flagship train 25, the 20th Century Limited, streaked up the river on track 1 behind a pair of E7 diesels. A Hudson locomotive bore down behind Don with the passenger train east on track 2, probably train 144, the Laurentian. Their closing speed was well over 100 miles an hour, and there's no motor drive on Don's 5x7 speed graphic. He had exactly 1 shot, and he timed it perfectly. He stuck around for one last train, number 63, the Water Level Limited, which followed the Century by 10 minutes. After all the elevated shots, I love how he crouched down low by the rails for this low-angle composition. I like to imagine Don in a pretty good mood as he drove home through the sunset this evening. He had exposed 16 sheets of 5x7 film on this day, all of them action shots, on 4 different railroads. In those 16 frames, he caught 17 trains, 15 of them led by steam locomotives. Truly a banner day. He continued shooting at a similar pace through the end of the year, and I'm going to keep running through more of his photographs from 1946 while I keep talking. None of these shots are in the book, and I think that's a testament to the quality of the photographs that are in the book. I took the time to show you every train Don photographed on June 23rd, 1946, because I wanted you to see what a really good day of train watching looked like back then. I wanted you to see a day through Don's eyes. When I started working on the Furler Collection, I have to admit that I harbored a certain bias against photographers like Don Furler, the ones who essentially hung up their cameras after steam locomotives stopped running. I grew up entirely in the diesel era, and while I always thrilled at seeing steam on museum, tourist, and excursion trains, the diesel-powered railroad was my everyday experience. The diesel-powered railroad is the railroad I came to love, and it's the railroad that I still try to find interesting ways of portraying in my photography. Even without steam locomotives, the diesel-powered railroads of Don Furler's middle age in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s offered vastly more visual interest than do today's railroads. Some of my first photographic heroes were Parker Lamb, Jim Shaughnessy, and Richard Steinheimer, who had been there for the end of steam and then learned to embrace the world of the diesel so they could continue to make interesting photographs of railroads. If they could do it, why didn't Don Furler? When I've been able to overcome a bias in my life, it's often started from empathy, from looking at a situation from someone else's perspective, from walking a mile in their shoes. I can't go back to 1946 and walk a mile along the tracks with Don Furler, much as I wish I could. But until we were able to hire another intern, I did digitize the first 2,000 of Don Furler's negatives myself. Going through them, I encountered one steam locomotive after another, and one perfect action shot after another. And what gradually sank in as I did that, in a way that it had never really sunk in with me before, was how these living machines had once been the everyday fabric of railroading, part of the everyday fabric of life itself. When you love something and you get to experience it every day, what a profound sense of loss you feel when it's gone. As I digitized these negatives in the quiet, early morning hours at our office, before the phone started ringing and anyone else was there, I made my peace with Don Furler and with all the steam photographers who hung up their cameras after the diesels came. Don's photographs put me in their shoes, or at least as close as I could come in the late 20-teens. I no longer blame them for what they did not shoot. I celebrate them for what they did photograph and for what they saved, so that we can enjoy it today and see a little of the world as they saw it through their eyes. Thank you. And I'm happy to stick around and take questions.
Great, thanks, Scott. Yep, and it looks like you have that page back up as a reminder for our deal tonight, that if you want to order the book, we are offering free shipping today. So we did have quite a few questions come in.
Great.
A few from Douglas Nelson. What was Don Furler's goal for these photographs other than being published in Trains? Is there anything that he said in writing, or is it just for enjoyment?
He did touch on that in writing. Trains published a special issue in 1941. They had an extended feature article about railroad photography specifically, and they reached out to about 15 or so different photographers. Don Furler was one of them. He sent photographs and a 6-page letter by, I think by telegram. It happened very quickly, and it was, I think, the longest letter he wrote to Trains. It had a lot of his photographic philosophy in it. Getting published was not necessarily his top foremost goal. I think it was more of something that he enjoyed doing because he enjoyed the community of photographers it created. More than anything, his goal was really to record his memories of these trains and these locomotives. He was pretty clear about that in his letters. And, if Alan's on here tonight, I'm sure he could say a little bit more to that. But his goals were, he loved steam locomotives. He loved seeing them operating in action out on the railroad, and his goals were to record those engines with as much clarity of detail in their landscape.
Cool. And then he's also wondering what kind of shutter speeds he used.
Yeah, so he shot with the 5x7 speed graphic, had a focal plane shutter that was capable of 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, which Don would have needed for some of these fast-moving trains. He shot with, I think, mainly Agfa Super Pan press film, which had an ISO rating of 200, which was pretty fast for that era. And he would set the shutter speed to basically as fast as he thought he needed, maybe 1/500th, 1/1000th, maybe a little bit slower if the light wasn't very good. And then he tried to shoot at f11 or as close to it as he could. He really valued a lot of depth of field in his photographs. He actually had some kind of derisive words towards Lucius Beebe because Beebe didn't have much depth of field in his photographs. The subject was sharp, but the background was often blurry, and Don really wanted sharpness all the way from the foreground to the background. So he tried to shoot it at f11 or even smaller apertures as much as it could. Obviously, that's kind of a losing battle between the high shutter speeds and the narrow apertures, but he did the best he could with the equipment he had.
Elizabeth Brown is wondering, could you please discuss further the difference between Furler's black and white prints versus later color prints? How do you discern the difference between the quality between the two?
Well, we looked at that slide earlier where we showed the different film sizes. And so, the 5x7 negatives are, I'd have to do the math, but they're like, 20 or more times more surface area than what you have on a 35 millimeter negative. So as you enlarge these 5x7 negatives, they just enlarge beautifully. Printing them 2 pages across the book, that's 22 inches wide, and they're tack sharp. The number boards, the locomotives, all the details are just razor sharp. If you enlarge a 35 millimeter slide that much, it's going to start to get blurry. Even with the sharpest Leica lenses and Kodachrome film that Don would have had available, which was quite good, just the limitations of such a smaller little piece of film compared to the enormous size of those 5x7 negatives just doesn't really hold up under big enlargements.
Did Don ever shoot anything in Birmingham, New York? Binghamton, New York.
Binghamton. If he did, it was only been briefly in passing. I'd have to go back and look. Alan might be able to speak to that too. Before he started doing action shots in the late 1930s, he did a lot of engine portraits with that big 8x10 view camera, and these were essentially staged photographs. The engines were at rest. These were 3/4 views of the locomotives themselves. Engine portraits, perfect description. And he did hundreds of these, mainly with his 8x10 view camera. And he traveled to a lot of different engine terminals. He may have gotten to Binghamton for some of those photographs, but I don't think he would have gotten to Binghamton for any pictures of action shots, at least not that I came across.
Bill Schaefer is wondering what he did to keep out of the armed services during World War II.
Well, Alan could answer that specifically, but he was in mechanical engineering, and he was an aircraft engine tester for Curtiss Wright. So he had a job that was directly related to military supply, and he would have been in his, he would have been 24, I think, when the war started, and just out of college. So my only guess is that through the value of his job testing aircraft engines, that was something that the military was willing to allow him to keep doing.
Did he do any photography for the armed services that you know of?
I don't know that. Ellen might be able to answer that. I don't know if he did any photography for Curtiss Wright or not. I don't think he did, but I'm not 100% positive.
Do you know if Don ever got a cab ride while he was photographing from some of the engineers he knew?
Yes, I know he did in Canada, and I think Alan even got some cab rides on some of their trips to the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific up in Ontario. After the war, Don settled on a career at a Continental Can Company as a mechanical engineer for them. They had rail service to the company, and Don, being the person he was, leveraged some of those contacts to arrange for some cab rides through that as well. But I don't think he photographed any of his cab rides. I think for him the photography was very compartmentalized into kind of one experience of railroading, and then cab ride was something else that he probably preferred to take in more viscerally and wasn't trying to document in photographs.
Yeah, for this next one, I think I can remember a specific story, but I was wondering, did he ever get into any trouble for climbing railroad signals and hiding in tunnels, or maybe just taking photos around certain areas in general?
Well, as I said, it's obviously a different era. These are not things you want to go out and do today. Some of the railroads I think were understanding and even sympathetic. I mentioned his engineer friend on the Erie, Bill Smith, and that led to most of the train crews on the Erie knowing who Don Furler was. They knew he liked Big Smoke. If they knew where he was, they would make sure he got Big Smoke whenever they went by. So that friendship with Bill Smith was really valuable to his photography, and I think to his access on the Erie. Obviously the railroad landscape was far more peopled back then. You had signal towers and depots all along the tracks that would have had station agents in them, operators. Some of these people couldn't care less if you were out climbing on the equipment, and would probably even tell you when the next train was coming. Other railroads were a little bit more, they weren't so friendly. I know the New York, Ontario, and Western was one that was particularly suspicious of spies during the war. Don managed to escape notice, but several of his friends would always get together, I think over Labor Day weekend, for a big holiday traffic rush on the New York, Ontario, and Western. They'd watch all the passenger trains go by. And during one of these, several of his friends were taken down to the local police station and had their cameras confiscated. The cameras were eventually returned and they were all let go. That stuff happened, particularly during the war. I think before and after the war, not as much on most of the railroads of the era. But during the war, there were a lot of suspicions. And you can see that in Don's photography. He did photograph during the war, but not nearly as much. He probably shot 400 pictures in 1941, and then, probably less than 100 a year in 42, 3, 4, and 5 before he really picked up again in 1946.
Paul Hensler is wondering if he ever photographed Altoona Curve in PA.
Yeah, he did get to the Pennsylvania Railroad main line and got to Horseshoe Curve. There's a wonderful shot he got at the Rockville Bridge that I did as a two-page spread in the book. There's, I think, 6 or 8 photographs on the Pensy. I really kind of focused on his close-to-home photographs in 1946 in the presentation tonight, but he did get to the Pennsylvania main line on a few occasions, and he loved that big-time mountain railroading. He got some very nice views of their locomotives.
And how about for New England states? How many different states did he get to up in the Northeast?
So Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. Actually, I don't know if he got Maine. He got a Maine Central train. I think it was right across the border in Crawford Notch, New Hampshire. That's a picture that's in the book. He got the Rutland, the Central Vermont, several of the New England roads. He didn't get up there as frequently as the ones close to home, but he did travel into New England a fair bit and did at least some photography there. There's a couple of really nice New Haven photographs in the book as well.
Yeah, it looks like we just got a question from one of Don's grandkids, Chelsea Clarkson.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for tuning in.
She's wondering, noting that rail knowledge isn't necessarily genetic, what we should be looking for in his rail photography that Don would value. And do you often come across a photographer with this sheer volume of work?
So you cut out on the first part. Could you say the first part of the question again?
What should maybe someone who doesn't know as much about rail photography be looking for in the photographs that you think Don would be valuing?
So, Don really, he was really a steam locomotive aficionado, and so he wanted to photograph, different types of steam locomotives in action. And this was kind of even a subset within the already subset of railroad photographers and enthusiasts. So the details of the locomotives were really important to him. What some of the things that really appeal to me about his work is the views of the landscape he takes in. This was the Northeast when it was still mainly either rural or industrial. Today most of these places are overly developed with suburban sprawl. There's very little rural places. There's very few industrial places, and so that was all wrapped up in these railroads, and that's all part of what Don captured in photography. Sometimes by happenstance, but I think sometimes also very intentionally, because he really looked for a sense of place in his photographs, and he was very good at finding elements to frame his images, whether it was part of the landscape or part of the railroad hardware, like the signals or the telephone poles or anything like that. He really tried to have interesting compositions that captured not just the trains, but also some of the land through which they passed. And as for the size of the collection, believe it or not, this is actually one of our smaller collections at the center. As photographers transitioned to color slides and 35mm film that was cheaper and faster to use, rates of taking photographs often, went up by an order of magnitude. We have a couple of color slide collections that have 50,000 images in them compared to about 6,000 black and white negatives in the Don Furler collection. I think there's a case to be made that as the number of photographs goes up, the number of good photographs may stay a little bit more consistent. And so in that regard, there's a really great concentration of quality images in Don's collection. That's one of its real strengths, as well as the great care he kept with organizing his photographs. Each negative is in its own envelope, and there was typewritten caption information on most of these envelopes with the location, the date, and often details about the train and the operation. And that's stuff that you just really can't preserve if photography doesn't take the time to write it down. And you not only took the time to write it down, you type it so that we could all read it very legibly. So from an archival metadata standpoint, this collection really sets a high bar.
And going back to you mentioning landscape, Eric Williams noticed that he obviously loved steam a lot, and he took a lot of front shots of trains approaching him, but there weren't so many of trains going away. So were there that many rear end shots in the collection? And on top, any shots that maybe more the train?
Yes. One of the challenges he faced with the 5x7 smooth graphic was that he could only shoot one sheet of film at a time. I mean, his film holders, I think, had a sheet of film on either side, but once you took a shot, you had to pull it out, flip it over, and stick it back in. So this was, with the train going by quickly, there was simply not time to take a shot and reload and take a second shot of it going away. You only had one chance. And so he really prioritized the views of the trains coming at it. That said, there's a couple of going away shots in the book that are some of my favorites. He certainly liked to do it when he had the opportunity. There's a one example on the B&O where he had a slow-moving train just getting started down along the Youghiogheny River in Pennsylvania. And he has a great shot of it approaching, and then it was going slowly, and you can see the exhaust is almost vertical. So it's only going a couple of miles an hour. And as it goes by, he's got another great shot of the going away view. It's actually the going away shot that I used in the book. I thought it was a stronger and more lyrical composition. There's a really nice shot on the New York Central on actually the other side of the Hudson River. We looked at photographs from the east side of the Hudson. He photographed the West Shore Railroad on the other side, also a New York Central operation. There's a nice low trestle over the river there close to Bear Mountain State Park where he set up for a train coming at him, and he got that shot, but wasn't making very much smoke. But he also took a going away shot of a train going the opposite direction that was making smoke, and it's really a beautiful shot, and he ended up using that in the book, and also it's one of the small photographs we use on the title page.
And did Don do all of his own printing?
And actually, I forgot to answer the second part of Eric's question about the landscape, and I'll get to the printing question in a moment. But yes, especially I think on the Lehigh and Hudson River, which was a railroad he photographed quite frequently. It ran through really beautiful pastoral scenery in northern New Jersey, so it was close to home. It had these nice open fields. It had a lot of traffic on it, a lot of trains of different railroads on it operating in certain places, which was pretty rare for that era. And so he would go up there quite a bit. And I think, he got a lot of great photographs, kind of the tighter 3/4 views that it really emphasized the locomotive. And as he did more of that, he eventually started to pull back more and take in more of that landscape. And I showed one shot early on of kind of a broadside view when the train's just sort of a thin line out there on the horizon. And it really emphasizes the trees and the field and the road. He did that several times on the Lehigh and Hudson River and a few other railroads as well. Not as his first photographic priority, but something he would certainly try to do from time to time. And then regarding printing, he did most of his own developing and printing. And actually, in that same 6-page letter to trains editors, where he talks a lot about his photographic philosophy, he talks a lot about his printing techniques as well. And so you can tell, and I talk a little bit about these in the book. He was really dedicated to the art of printing. Every time he made a submission to Trains magazine, he always emphasized that if any of the prints could be done differently to lead to better reproductions in the magazine, to please let him know, and he would make changes and submit new prints. So, he did his own printing. He really favored contact prints. That's the reason he used the 8x10 view camera for his engine portraits, and the reason he wanted to get the 5x7 speed graphic for his action shots. The enlargers of the day weren't as sharp as I think some of the optics we have available now, and they just couldn't hold the detail in making larger prints that he wanted. So he really talked a lot about the importance of printing and the importance of sharpness and fine grain in his work. He had very specific ideas about what films to use, what chemicals, what temperatures. He was certainly a master of the craft in that regard. I know he did have a friend of his, Gordon Roth, someone that he worked with a lot, and they were kind of compatriots. And Gordon actually went on to a very successful career as a professional photographer. And Gordon actually made some very large enlargements of Don's work, some 16 by 20 and 20 by 24 inch prints that he could, have framed and hung in on his living room walls. And I think Alan still might have a couple of those today. But that was, Don didn't have an enlarger big enough to make prints of that size, and so he had his friend Gordon make those for him.
And then, are you aware then, concerning how much work he put into making and taking these photographs, and any awards for them?
That I don't know. It's interesting just about his publications. After those early years of really having a pretty strong relationship and getting a lot of publication at Trains magazine, he didn't seek a lot of national publication after that. He was very active in his local railroad groups, the NRHS chapters and Railroad Indians, and I think a couple of the other groups, the railroad enthusiasts of his region. So there were several groups he was active with there. And he contributed to some of their in-house publications and some books that local authors were working on. But he really didn't seek the spotlight. I think photography for him was a very personal approach, and it was something that he did with his close groups of friends in the area. And just not something that he really, outside of those first few years of submitting a lot of stuff to Trains magazine, just not something he really prioritized. And I think it's one of the reasons that John Gruber called him a creative but almost forgotten photographer, back in that 2004 presentation. It was just something that he hadn't been in the limelight or, in print, at least on a national scale, for quite a long time. And I'm just so delighted that John was able to track down Alan for that, and that Alan's become a friend, and that the photography came to us, because, this is, to me, this is some of our strongest material of really early action photography. And it shows, so it's important just from the photographic genre from that standpoint, and also the fact that it shows this northeastern industrial and rural landscape before it was changed irrevocably, is just incredibly important to me. This is a collection I'm really glad we have.
Absolutely. Speaking of regional content, David Maney is wondering if there are any Western Maryland shots included in the book.
Quite a few, actually. I mean, that's a railroad near and dear to my heart. I was born in Elkins, West Virginia. It's really disappointed we couldn't have a red dot on the map showing a Furler photograph of Elkins, West Virginia. He did go there one time, but was met with utterly torrential rains and just horrible weather, and didn't end up making any photographs, and had a really kind of a harrowing drive over the mountains to get back into Maryland that evening. So Elkins is unfortunately not represented, at least for any action shots. I think he did get a few engine portraits there, but no action photographs. But he did photograph the main line of the Western Maryland quite a bit. And I can look in the index and tell you that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 Western Maryland photographs in the book. He really liked their 4664 Challenger locomotives, and really tried to get them working out on the main line. And there's some excellent photographs of them, as well as their 280s and 280s.
And what about any photographs taken of the New Jersey Lackawanna Cutoff?
Yes, there are a couple of photographs from the Lackawanna Cutoff. It had some big fills and big tunnels, and he definitely prioritized some shots there. There's a couple of views of some of the Lackawanna 484s coming out of those tunnels with just vertical exhaust erupting. I'm sure Don would have been very pleased on those days, and there's at least one or two of those shots in the book, along with some other really nice Lackawanna images.
I think we may have covered this earlier on, but was there any direct correspondence between David P. Morgan and Don Perler?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know that for a fact, but Don's days of contributing to Trains were really during the Al Kalmbach era, and those very first years in the magazine. So I'm not aware of any correspondence between Don Furler and David P. Morgan. Alan, if you're aware, if you're listening, or I'll ask you later. If you are, I'd certainly be interested to know about it. We'd be happy to pass that on to whoever's asking the question.
And this could also potentially be a question for Alan. Carol Menzies is wondering where she could possibly purchase photos of his work. I'm assuming outside of our newly published book.
Well, we've shared a number of his photographs on our website, and it's our policy at the center for personal use. We'd make high-res scans available at no charge. If you just want to let us know if there's an image you find on the website, at least if you go to the collections tab, you can browse through a bunch of Don's photographs there, and get in touch with you can get in touch with either of us, but we'd put you in touch with our archivist, Adrian Evans. He could help you with those requests. As long as it's for personal use, there's no charge.
And Greg Zamba, sorry if I said your name incorrectly, says he's always admired Robert Collins and his photographic style, and notes that Don's photos are similar, not only for the way that the photos are shot, but also the locations and the three-quarter views, and is wondering if there are any stories about his relationship with Robert Collins, or if they had any sort of friendship at all.
So in the photograph I showed early on of the fiasco where they got stuck in the mud, that's Bob Collins gesturing on the right, and Don's the one leaning on the shovel on the left, laughing. I mean, they were best friends. Alan grew up calling Bob Collins his Uncle Bob. I think that's how close they were, and they remained close all the way until the end of their lives. There's pictures of them in the 1990s out watching double stack container trains in the New York Susquehanna and Western. And they were just amazed by that development in their local railroad community, and continued to follow it all throughout their lives, even though they didn't photograph it very much. So yeah, they were definitely close friends, photographed together frequently. Actually, there were a few of Furler's photographs, and again, his metadata is excellent, his caption information is excellent, but there were a few of the ones that we didn't have information on, where we found an identical Bob Collins photograph in a book somewhere, and we were able to, they were clearly standing side by side, and so we were able to use that to track down the caption information for Don's photographs. You could also tell that Don was a little bit taller, because his perspective is always a couple inches or 6 or 7 inches higher than Bob's was. And I know Don also used a ladder for some of his shots. He really liked to be right up kind of at the level of the running boards of the locomotives to try to minimize distortions as much as possible. But yeah, they traveled together frequently, and took a lot of shots standing shoulder to shoulder.
And that leads right into this next question by Alan Held, who, outside of maybe the height difference, are there any discernible differences in the method or quality between Bob and Don, even when they're photographing the same train?
Well, Don did have that nice big 5x7 speed graphic, so he had twice as much surface area in his negatives to work with. So, when it comes down to film grain and detail, Don's photographs are always going to have a little bit more of it. So he really emphasized the technical quality, and that's to take nothing away from the 4x5 negative, which is a far larger format than I've ever used, and has stunning quality when it's done well. But Don was able to have twice as much of that. So there's just more information and more clarity and sharpness in Don's negatives. And beyond that, I don't know Bob Collins's work as well as I know Don, so it's hard for me to speak to the differences directly. But I do know Don was willing to take risks as a photographer. These guys did tend to prefer sunny days when they could really have a fast shutter speed and a narrow aperture. But that said, Don definitely got out on some pretty crummy days, and he made some really wonderful photographs on some of those crummy days. Actually, if anyone were to ask me my favorite Furler photograph, it actually wouldn't be one of the ones from Appalachia, even though that's where I grew up and it's near and dear to my heart. But it's really the stuff from the Northeast that I didn't know as much about, and Don really kind of opened my eyes to it. And in November of 1940, he went out on the Redding's Catawissa branch on this just dismal November Sunday afternoon. Not the kind of day I would expect him to be out with his camera. But at the time, the Reading had this practice. They'd send 3 trains east every Sunday afternoon on the Catawissa branch in quick succession. I know this because Don wrote paragraphs about it on the envelopes for these negatives. And for one of these trains, he climbed up on a hillside and is looking down at the tracks. Then the tracks go sort of, snaking off, clinging to the hillside in the background, and the creek and the river valley are down below. And the train's coming up the grade, and it's got 1 locomotive on the front and 2 more pushing. And he made a series of 3 photographs. And the first one shows the head end engine passing. The second one has just the coal hoppers rolling below, and then the 2 pusher locomotives are off on the ledge far in the distance. And then the third shot is as the pushers come right below it. And those 3 shots I found just as captivating as anything in Appalachia that I'd grown up seeing. And I published them in the book as a series on one spread, with each the 3 images side by side by side. I think it's as much for me just being shown something that I was completely unaware of and totally captivated by, but the fact that he was out there on that dismal day and still really captured a really, really breathtaking view of that landscape on that railroad operation makes it one of my favorite photographs in this collection.
And do you know if he ever got out west with Bob, where he did quite a bit of his work?
And if he did, he didn't photograph out there, and I don't think he really traveled out west very much. I know he made several trips to Canada, but again, once steam operations kind of started to wind down on the Northeast, he really kind of refocused on his family and his career. And photography continued to be something he did kind of as a hobby with steam fan trips. But I do know he got out for some of the NRHS steam trips that happened at various conventions. throughout the Midwest and the West in the 80s and 90s, early 90s. But I don't think he traveled out west very much. He certainly didn't photograph railroads out west.
Maybe just one more question on that, at least some friendships that he'd made during his career. Do you know if he ever had much of a relationship with Hastings and or Shaughnessy?
Hastings, I don't think so, but Shaughnessy, absolutely. And I talk about this some in my essay in the book. Alan talks about it a bit more in his afterword. But there was a group of guys who got together in the basement of one man, a gentleman named Michael Koch, Koch, who hosted these gatherings in his basement on a semi-regular basis. And these were in the late 50s and early 60s. And they were groups of 15 or so people, and people, they would bring prints and kind of critique each other's work. And Mike was often commissioned paintings and would have his newest painting on display for everyone to keep an eye at. And so there was a lot of camaraderie there, and a lot of critiquing and artistic growth. And Jim Shaughnessy attended these as well. And I think they became very great friends through that. And I think Jim was someone who probably helped Don to appreciate some of the more unusual views of railroad photography a little bit more than he may have at first. But yeah, those two were definitely close friends and they kept in touch throughout most of their lives.
This next question, I think I may be able to answer a little bit more than you. David Lester is wondering if there are any plans for a traveling exhibition. And while I can say there's no plans at the moment to do an exclusive show featuring Don Furler's work, that's not to say that some of his collections aren't being considered for a composite show that we're working on that I'm not sure that we're at the point of sharing exactly what the theme is, but to definitely tell you, whoever's listening tonight, to stay tuned and wait to hear more about that, hopefully in a few more months.
Absolutely.
Alan Held, again, has one other question about how long you think maybe Don waited to take some of his shots. And
just in terms of waiting for the train to come. I'm sure, like all of us, he had some pretty long waits out there trackside. It's clear that he had pretty good information or good knowledge of what the operations were just based on the number of trains he was able to photograph on a lot of days. The passenger trains ran on schedules and typically relatively close to those schedules most of the time. Some of the freight trains were scheduled. A lot of them were extras. The railroad landscape was a more populated place. There were often people to ask, whether it was, a depot station agent or, an operator out at a signal tower or someone like that. So, I think as much as he could, he would have gotten that information and tried not to wait too long. But I think any of us will tell you, any era, if you photograph a lot of trains, you're going to spend some time waiting for trains, and Don certainly did that. I know some of his photographs he describes as, just going, being on a drive somewhere and having the camera with him, and he'd see a train or a tube of smoke off in the distance and go tearing off on a detour someplace to get a shot. I know that happened on the Western Maryland a couple of times. I know he wrote about it on capturing a Lehigh, New England camelback one time, and a shot he was very fond of that he sent to Al Kalmbach at Trains magazine. So he definitely took some grab shots, or at least as close to grab shots as he could with the setup that his 5x7 camera required. But yeah, I'm sure there were some long waits too, although he didn't write too much about those. But certainly there were, just looking through his collection, there were some days that he kind of staked out a certain spot, and some of the lines were quite busy, like we saw in the New York Central. There were trains by every few minutes, but others, he may have only seen a few in the course of an afternoon or even a day. So he definitely waited sometimes.
He waited to take the best shot, not just throw away a bunch.
I love that quote that, his to take but few pictures if necessary and take them well.
I think we're going to wrap up with two final questions.
Okay.
First, do you know if he ever shot with Don Wood or if they ever overlapped?
If they did, I'm not aware of it. And I don't think, those pictures at the gatherings that Michael Koch posted, I think those often show some of Don's closest friends, and I'm pretty sure that Don Wood was not in I'm just turning to that page in the book right now, but I don't think I would have remembered that. So yeah, the group shot that we have in the book includes Walter Lucas, Alan and Don, George Meyer, Mike Koch, Bob Malinowski, Jim Shaughnessy, Philip Ronfer, Bob Collins, Bob Minard, William S. Young, I think that's a name some people would know, Andy Wittenborn, Douglas Warnham, John Krause, John Briggs, Bill Price, and another name people would know, and the photograph was taken by Gordon Roth. So those are the ones I have direct evidence of. I'm sure Alan would be able to provide more information on that.
Yeah, Ellen wrote nothing would. Okay, final question, more for a question for you and your perspective in putting this book together. Jeff Moffat wants to know how much wailing and gnashing of teeth was involved in making the final selections.
You know, I have a philosophy when I'm working on any project that once the stuff on the cutting room floor is starting to look pretty good, you know, that's when the project itself is probably getting close to finished, and that was certainly a good point to arrive at with this one. You know, I think anytime you're making selections between, you know, multiple good images for a single slot, there's going to be some wailing and gnashing of teeth. But you know, I feel like most of the photographs, the selections for this felt kind of natural to me. You know, I went for a lot of geographic diversity. I wanted to try to cover as much of the territory as Don covered as we could, and to, you know, also just for marketability by having more railroads and more regions depicted. So, you know, I tried to get as much of that in there and make sure that the big railroads that would have had more of a following were well represented. And then beyond that, you know, I really tried to include views that I thought really epitomized kind of non-stylistic preferences, and then also pull in some of the outliers that I thought ended up being really strong images to show some variety. So those were kind of the things I looked for. And you know, it was interesting. Don always noted which side of the train he photographed. Even the action shots, they noted whether it's the left side of the locomotive or the right side of the locomotive. And as I was starting to make some of my initial edits, I actually got one folder with trains going from right to left, and I put another folder with trains going from left to right. And there were a whole lot more of one than the other, but I tried to, I think because he tended to photograph more in the afternoons and the mornings, just based on his work schedule and such. But that was, I've never done a book that way, but it provided, I think, some good, it was easy for me to kind of go back and pull. If I came to a page where I really felt like I needed the train going in one direction or the other, I had those folders readily available. I also made folders for vertical shots. There weren't as many of those, and then I had another folder that was kind of, you know, a broadside or a big landscape shot or something that was just, you know, not quite a typical view. So that was kind of an interesting way to make an initial arrangement of photographs. You know, and yeah, there are some great photographs that just, you know, we weren't able to pull in at the last minute. Sometimes, you know, and actually there was some good back and forth between Alan and me. You know, he accuses me, and probably rightly so, of going for a little bit too many of the dreary photographs. And I had this one really kind of dreary, somber day on the Ontario and Western with one of their diesel locomotives leading a freight train past a, you know, kind of a downtrodden scene, and which I thought was a great metaphor for the Ontario and Western and the bankruptcy approaching it. But Alan, I think, wisely talked me into using a nice sunny shot from one of Don's favorite spots up on the Lehigh and Hudson River. And that's the image we actually ended up using on the back cover of the book. It's a photograph that I think really epitomizes you know, Don's stylistic preferences, and was a good swap. So we definitely did some horse trading, and you know, certainly there are some good photographs that didn't make it. We saw a lot of good photographs that didn't make it in the presentation tonight. Yeah, you know, and it is frustrating, but at the same time, it's putting these things together is a lot of fun. It's a privilege and an honor to be able to do it, and I really enjoy it. And you know, when you get to that point that you're choosing between multiple good options, that's when you know you're going to hopefully have a pretty strong product.
Well, I think we've gone through all of our questions. Thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time to go through, I think, all, if not almost all, the questions that have been sent in, and for your fantastic work on this. I know you've worked so hard and put in so many extra hours, and the product speaks for itself.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. It's really a joy to be able to share this collection. I hope you'll buy the book. We'll get it out to you as soon as we can. We're lucky to have a distributor that's going full throttle during the pandemic. So, and hopefully we can even maybe have an in-person signing one of these days. Who knows when that'll be? But Haley, thank you for the setting up the event and all your great work on moderating the questions. It's easy easy for me to answer them when you feed them to me that way. So thanks so much. Thanks everyone for the great questions. It's a collection I've really come to personally value a great deal, and it sure is fun to talk about. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.